guys are ready?
Do we have mics or not?
Yeah, these will pick up what you say. So
Okay, awesome.
Är det liksom att hålla på här också?
All right, friends, we're running a little late, but let's try to begin. We'll have a packed room today, so I think pretty much every seat will be filled, so the people out in the hall get to find a spot. Of course, the most difficult ones to get to, but that's the price of being late. So my name is Andreas Elving. I work at Svenska Bildningsförbundet as an advisor, and on behalf of our executive director, who's not here at the moment, Magnus Öster, I'd like to welcome you all to this hour-long lunch discussion. Many of you may not be familiar with our organization, but Svenska Bildningsförbundet sometimes does discussions in other languages than Swedish, even though our name suggests that we're a Swedish-speaking organization, like today. We want to add new perspectives into the Finnish debate, and one way of fulfilling those tasks is the thing we're doing here today. I'm looking forward to a very interesting hour with a very distinguished panel, and I will not introduce them. I'll leave that to my colleague Jaan Siitonen, who's the brain behind this event today. So welcome to you all, and let's enjoy our lunch. Jaan.
Thank you, everybody. And do you hear me back there as well? Good. Welcome to our event, Russia, Next Generation. What's up? My name is Jaan Siitonen, and I work here as a political advisor together with Andreas. And the idea of this event came from the idea that when we think about today's politics, we often hear what today's politicians talk, but rarely do we have an arena for younger people to talk about the future, talk about their hopes and concerns. And I think as young people, we have a responsibility to take the arena and talk what we want to see for the future. I hope you guys have been fine after Christmas, and I imagine that everybody watched the hockey game. Really? Did you watch the hockey game? That's a good topic for our discussion today as well. But further, I'm going to introduce the panel now, and then we're going to start the discussion. To my left here, we have Maria Snegovaya. She's a columnist at Vedomosti newspaper. She has also written previously on numerous different newspapers, including New Republic. She lives in Washington D.C, and she is also a doctoral candidate at the Columbia University. And she's really into Russian politics, and she's really known in Washington. Then we have Elis Hendell. He studies at Åbo Academy, Russian language and culture. He's also the chairman for the Swedish youth at Turku region. And then we have Daria Krivono. She is also a doctoral candidate here at University of Helsinki, and her research topic is the young Russian speakers in Finland and how they are employed. And now we're going to have keynotes. Every three of our panelists are going to speak about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we are going to have a discussion after that. So, Maria, welcome to Finland. And
thank you. Thank you very much, dear all, for welcoming me here today. It's a big honor for me to be presenting in Finland. It's my first time talking here, although I used to live in St. Petersburg and come here very often. I love this country. And thank you for improving the weather, because yesterday was very cold. So I just wanted to really briefly give you the sociological overview of the Russian youth and how they're different from the adults. Are they different, first of all, or are they the same as the Russian adults? In which dimensions are they different? And given those differences, how do they view the West and their relationship with the West and the future of Russia in terms of those relationships, right? First of all, it's really important to talk about the Russian youth because of the Russian middle class that, according to different estimates, already constitutes 40% of the Russian population. The so-called Russian youth groups, those are the groups from 18 to 35 years old, and I'll be talking about different kind of groups within the younger Russians. The younger Russians within the middle class per se constitute about 60% of the total middle class in Russia, right? That's a lot, right? So the middle class in Russia, at least half of the middle class in Russia, are the younger Russians, and they're hopefully the drive of the future change. So what are they? How are they, right? First of all, it's important to understand the thing that many sociologists point out, and that is that the majority of the Russian population is pretty homogeneous, which is pretty much an unfortunate, reality is given their overwhelming support for Putin, their overwhelming support for Crimea annexation, and all those aggressive adventurism of Russia on the international stage. That homogeneity of the Russian population also means that they're quite patriarchic in their attitudes. That means that they largely do not believe in the institutions, they tend to value personalities more, and they really tend to believe in the power hierarchy. That's kind of the sad part of the story. On the upside of the story, however, are the differences, are the dimension on which the youth is different from the adults. And that is first and foremost actually the openness to the world, to the West in particular. And they're actually overall more pro-democratic and pro-Western stance on whatever dimension you take. So if you look at Levada polls, or if you look at the social psychology estimates, for example, based on European Social Survey, you'll see that the younger Russians are much more open to change than the adults, than the average Russian. That makes them actually much closer to the Western European counterparts than the average Russian again. They also tend to be more democratic, and we see almost a 10% difference with the adults, with the average Russian again, which is a substantive difference, of course. Also, they kind of feel that they're more capable of changing the country through their civic activity, tend to value freedoms, civic freedoms more, such as freedom of speech, etc., and also tend to be more tolerant. So they're much more European and Westernized in many dimensions. If you talk, be it their attitudes to LGBT community, or be it overall attitude to the West. They also tend to be more active, and this kind of active civic stance means they're much more volunteering. And you see younger Russians, especially in the big cities, becoming much more active in the volunteering projects, starting their own startups, trying to help the elderly or people with certain disabilities, etc. Those are definitely good developments, make them much closer to their Western counterparts. Another important dimension, which also has to do with the attitudes to the West, is the fact that the younger Russians do not suffer from the post-imperial syndrome, the problem that the adults in Russia unfortunately suffer from, right? The older generation in Russia used to live in the Soviet Union, this great country which used to compete with the United States only, right? They didn't used to bother about smaller countries. Like, who cares about Ukraine, really? Is there such a country, as Putin says? But that is not true to the younger Russians. They largely do not remember the Soviet Union, so they do not regret the collapse of the empire. They tend to repeat, and it's true, they tend to repeat whatever the state media says or whatever their family says, but they don't really believe in that. When they support Putin's policies, even on the foreign policy, they tend mostly to repeat what the propaganda says rather than have the personal, emotional attachment to that, because they do not regret the Soviet Union, they do not remember the Soviet Union mostly. And that has to do with their overall attitudes to the West. Again, the younger Russians are the most pro-Western group in the society. Over 40 to 50% of the Russians have overall positive views of the West, in average, Finland included, of course, versus about 10% only of the younger generation who tend to view it negatively. That makes them also less as I said, far less susceptible to the anti-Western state rhetoric. So when on the state TV channel or on the state website they have basically have this propaganda campaign about the, Finnish people, Estonians being all Nazis, right? They don't believe it because they've been there, their families have been there, or they've heard a lot about that, or maybe they have friends in those countries, and they tend to be less susceptible to anti-Western rhetoric, which is, of course, is a good thing. That also makes them more optimistic about the overall development of the Russia's foreign relations with the West. They tend to think, because they tend to view West more positively, they also tend to think that the current tensions, the current problem that Russia has with the West will evaporate pretty soon. Those are temporary, mild things that are actually not important, and they will evaporate pretty soon. That is, again, unlike the adults, those people with the post-imperial syndrome, with the members of the Soviet past, to whom the current tensions with the West means they come back, a return to the Cold War period, right? The younger Russians do not remember the Cold War. They hardly remember the Soviet Union. They don't know, few of them know who Gorbachev is. Pretty much no one remembers Yeltsin, the 1990s, and all these things. So to them, no personalized emotional attachment to the Soviet past, which makes them, their attitudes to the West much more positive and also much more flexible, which is, overall, if you think about it, is a good thing. On the downside, of course, as I mentioned, a lot of, you probably observed that too among the Finnish younger generation as well, the problems with the contemporary society is the lack of certain skills that used to make previous generation more used to create more holistic views of the world to the previous generation. For example, contemporary Russians are much more, of course, into internet and social networks and all this so-called clip mindset. When you do not read a book, you just get a summary of that book on the internet somewhere. That actually results, and also lack of the basically state, constructed state view on the past, together with the unreformed educational system, makes the views of the past of Russia very unstructured. As I mentioned, they hardly know who Gorbachev is. They don't know Yeltsin at all. They pretty much know Stalin. There was something called Soviet Union. They don't really know what that is. And then Putin all of a sudden. The majority of them believes that Putin came in the 1990s. They have not heard about Yeltsin even, and they think that Putin has been there for a while, which is a bad thing. Many younger Russians don't know any other leader of the country besides Putin, right? Which is pretty much the Soviet realities, if you think about that. Also, as I mentioned, very unstructured view of the history, lack of holistic views, also results in the lack of critical thinking. They don't know how to criticize the past. Russian society in general, as we know, unfortunately, have not been able to overestimate its past, its history. Like the attitudes toward repressions, towards the Stalin's role in the history is not understood well in Russia. That results in the complete vagueness of the attitudes toward the past, and also unfortunately leads to many younger Russians being supportive of Stalin. So because they think Stalin strengthened the country, he was a big leader and Russia used to be strong, they get that primarily from the families, and of course, overall that's not a good thing. If you want to summarize the attitudes in one sentence, they want pretty much to live in a democratic country ruled by Stalin. How do you like that? Yeah. Exactly. So that's pretty much this postmodern attitudes to the past, whether they don't really understand what Russia used to be, what it is now. They kind of want to be powerful and big, but also kind of westernized in terms of freedoms, personal, individual freedoms that they get. Of course, with that kind of mindset, you don't really have a generation that would be a driver of change, right? Because it doesn't really understand, lacks any kind of constructed identity. They do not understand what they are, what their position in the society, and how do they understand the society in general. That's obviously a downside. Now, that overall That, and also the fact that this generation of the younger Russians matured throughout the 1990s when the state was weak, there was lack of any kind of systemic education and views position on the past of Russia, makes them quite politically apathetic. They, as I mentioned, younger Russians tend to be on average more civically active, which is true in every single dimension of their life except for political dimension. They don't think that politics matters. They think that they are not powerful, unable to change, important to change the political realities, and they tend to delegate the political authority to the adults. So they tend to say, you know, I understand like my startup, my business, I understand my volunteering project and what I want to do with my future, with my family. But as to the politics, that's not my business. It's dirty, you know, everybody's corrupt, the position is bad. Putin is good, by the way. Of course, everybody else is good. Officials, state officials are horrible, everybody's corrupt and dirty. I don't want to deal with that at all. That's what they say. And please let this decide to the adults. So essentially, they delegate the political decision-making to the adults. That's, of course, not a very positive development, because at the age of 30, you probably want to understand what to do with your country, what to do with yourself. That's an important, basically important characteristic of the Russians, younger Russians. Now, but everything I said before was the reflections on the younger Russians altogether, from 18 to about 30 years old, right? But it's also important to point out that within that larger cluster of the younger Russians, there's two very distinct groups of the younger Russians. The ones from 18 to 24, the so-called Generation Y, those whose maturity, whose life mostly happened under Putin, and they don't know any other leader. And there's also Generation X. This is my generation, those who went to school during the 1990s, when the state was weak, there was lack of state propaganda, and they are now in their beginning of the active life. They're right now starting their careers, starting to work actively, etc., etc. So it's interesting how the very brief period in the Russian institutions, so from the early 1990s to the early 2000s, you had a relatively liberal period in Russia, right? And relatively weak state, no state propaganda, no state-imposed propaganda. So only 10 years actually influenced the generation in a very substantive way. The younger people of this younger cluster tend to be much more liberal and much more interested in politics and much more basically civically engaged than the later population. So you see that on every other dimension. So they tend to be much more critical of the country, where the country is going, much more supportive of the West, and basically compromising and with the West, becoming part of the West of the country, and tend to actually see the future of Russia quite negatively. This is when we talk about the generation of the late 20s, early 30s, like Yeltsin's generation. That, of course, changes dramatically if you look at the younger generation. The 18 to 24 years old are very much pro-Putin. They have not seen any other leader, right? All their lives pretty much have happened pretty much under Putin, which of course is a very troublesome development. In fact, they're supportive of Putin, they're the most pro-Putin group in the society. From 70 to 55% of the younger Russians within that group, 18 to 24, are strongly supportive of Putin, and more so than the adults, which is, of course, obviously is a problem. They also tend to think of Russia basically getting off its knees, tend to support and repeat all the so-called, propaganda cliche. We're now going to basically combat the West. We're going to win over the West. Russia is moving to its greater future, recreating its great Soviet past, etc., etc., etc. Where do they get this information from? This is interesting because majority of the younger Russians tend to say they don't watch TV. Watching TV right now in Russia is not cool. Even if you do that, you don't say that publicly, And most of them say they get their news from the internet and mostly get the information from the internet. But when you actually look at what they say, which is interesting, most of in their rhetoric, they tend to exactly repeat the state TV propaganda cliche. So they say they don't watch TV, but at the same time, what they say is exactly the state TV cliche. It's basically word by word. So where do they get it from? Are they lying to us when they say they don't watch TV, which is very possible? Another explanation is that in Russian society in general, which is a problem overall, the trust, the radius of trust, the so-called trust level, is very low. So I personally only trust to my close relatives, to my very close circle of the family and my friends, right? I don't trust to anybody else, and that kind of also influences the political apathy. I don't trust those politicians. They can't change anything. They're all corrupt. Let them be. So the very low level of trust means that they tend to repeat and follow very closely whatever their relatives say. So if they don't watch the TV propaganda, their parents do, and so their parents influence very strongly their viewpoints on the attitudes. But so this is very important to understand two large clusters within the young generation, 18 to 24, 24 to 35. Importantly and positively here is that, once again, a very short period of freedom in the Russian history, the Yeltsin's period in 1990s, there was no state propaganda, has been able to influence the development of the younger Russian in a very substantive way, which is still significant, 15 years afterwards. This is a very significant positive development, which leaves a lot of promise in the future. Because even if we do see that the very young Russians, those from 18 to 24 years old, are more pro-Putin and more brainwashed than the average, we do see that their attitudes and preferences are very easily malleable, right? Depending on what they get on the state TV, depending on the state institutions. And shall the situation in the country change, if the state TV channels get liberalized, if the propaganda is softened, we shall see the difference in those attitudes come very abruptly and very strong, especially given the fact that the younger Russians are much more pro-Western and generally positive about the West. And so, just to finish on the positive, ending, according to different analysts in Russia, if we get the state TV propaganda replaced by a more positive pro-Western outlook, if we get the state TV channels to basically replace the content with more pro-Western attitudes, the general attitudes of the younger Russians shall change in just a couple of months. So even though some of the trends within the younger Russians are reflective of the more general, broader trends within the Russian societies, unfortunately they're not that positive given the overall negative trends within the Russian society. This is very changeable and shall change if the state institutions also improve. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And it was very good information. And next we're going to go to Elis Hendell. We're going to talk about your time in Russia and your kind of point of view of Russian, what you know about the culture and language and the young generation.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see so many here listening to, for me, a really important topic, for me, like an everyday topic, but many people don't think about Russia every day. How?
Maybe it's a good thing.
Maybe it's a good. Yeah, you get a bit frustrated every now and then. I study the Russian language and literature for the 4th year in Åbo Academy in Turku. And what first got me into studying Russian was not the same thing. Maybe it's I just happened to start studying Russian, but then as I continued studying, my love for both Russian literature and culture has grown ever so strong, but also it has also naturally been combined into my interest in politics. I'm active in Svensk Ungdom. And then when I first got in touch with Russian politics and Russian media in general, then I found like new dimension and a new reason for studying Russian, because I understood how low our understanding both culturally and politically is, even though we are neighboring countries and Russia is immensely important neighbor for us in every aspect of life. The understanding on every levels of our society is extremely low. It's next to absurd, I think. And that's the driving force of my studies have been the frustration for people not understanding Russia and for Russians not understanding West. And I'm like in there in between trying to explain everything. Why is it like that? Why aren't people following Putin still, and why? And so many questions and no answers. And my studies, 4 years of studies, it has been a really turbulent time. It's a really interesting time in Russian society and politics. I mean, my first year, 2011, at my first basic courses, we were following the news and following immensely huge anti-Putin protests. And we were discussing them and what's going to happen, and everybody thought there's going to be like a more democratic and pro-Western Russia. But then it turned totally on its head. And I've been following like the downfall of the pro-Western Russia and the rise of a more nationalistic Russia and more Russian Russia, and until the recent events of Ukraine. I missed some lectures just following the Maidan live streams and all the things happening around Ukraine, and it all escalated to when I lived for Russia 3 months, studied in the city of Tver, close to Moscow, and that was an especially interesting time to be in Russia. It was the spring of 2015. Spring means Victory Day in Russia, День Победы, and it was not a regular Victory Day. It was the 70th anniversary, so it was like a huge day in Russian history, and even followed by I could sense how the national spirit and nationalistic spirit grew during my 3 months there. It's only 3 months, but I still felt it's okay. It was spring, the weather got warmer, people got out on the streets, and you could feel and it all escalated. We were traveling in Russia and just came back to Moscow for the Victory Day and decided to stay there to watch what could you say, the show. I mean, it was crazy, and I felt scared of I have a hard time understanding how from a Finnish point of view, how nationalistic a country can be, how they can celebrate such a tremendous thing as the Second World War. Okay, the victory, but still, at what cost? Nobody questioning it. Mm-hmm. And the amount of people, 500,000 people in the streets at the same time, it's unimaginable. And at the same time, we had courses at the university, Tver State University, reading news and following news with really an interesting, let's say, old professor of the old Soviet Guard. So at the time, there were no Russians in Ukraine. There was no question about it, and so much of this, state propaganda on lecture time, and no way to discuss it, because it's not the strongest language for me, so I was not the one to question. But it was interesting to see that part of society, because and that they actually believe it. And I also made I made a final report on the for my exchange on there was this crazy submarine crisis of Russian submarines basically everywhere in the Baltic Sea, but at the time outside of Helsinki, allegedly. And I made a report on how the Russian media had reported on these incidents in Finland. And at that point I understood like how grave lies you can lie in a state-owned media. And it also raised my interest in reading Russian media, and I'm also doing my bachelor's thesis on the subject, continuing this subject. But I must point out that the Finnish media isn't 100% good on this either. You can trust the bigger houses or media houses, but still we have our flaws too. The questions, when I got invited to this seminar, the question was, why are we interested in the Russian youth? Why? I mean, we have our youth and our problems. Then again, I don't see, in the end we have the same problems as youth in Russia and youth in Finland. I mean, we are young, we have a bad economic situation, we gotta find work, we don't have money to go abroad, and the future doesn't look too bright. That's like the main problem everywhere now. But my main concern for the Russian youth is what the politics will like bring them to, because the youth of today is the future leaders, and they're probably gonna be my colleagues. So I gotta know what kind of future leadership they're building there now. And it's all about it's the understanding that we still lack. And I'm mostly interested in how we could get more understanding of Russian culture and Russian people, because it's the thing, once you're there, or once they are here, you just realize, well, we're the same, basically. Then when you like the discussion goes into politics, and then you get to like feel how different we are in that sense. But it's only there. That's how they interpret the reality, because that's their reality, and this is our reality. They are different. The maybe most shocking question I got, or not question but statement I got while in Russia was a Russian guy stating that, yeah, but we were allies during the war. At that point, at that point I got a bit angry, and my understanding ended there. But it was an interesting statement, because for us it's hard to understand that somebody would not know our history. But then again, it's a problem in our view of history too. We are too anti-Russian still, and that doesn't help, I'd say. This is the main. This is the important question. What are like the politics of today doing to the children? And think about the children. Think about the youth. You could say, I've heard a joke about the only thing you can trust is the future, because the past can be changed all the time. You can rewrite history. Mm-hmm. And this is not a laughing matter, because they are reshaping history in Russia. And even now they are fixing up some historical flaws of which also history was fixed during the 90s in a more liberal way, like in a more understanding way. Okay, we did some bad things, and they admitted it. But now we're going back to the glorification of, for example, Stalin, which is, in my eyes, is totally ridiculous. Also interesting for for the education is that people are not skeptical. I mean, for me, the most important thing in education is to be skeptical about everything you hear, question everything. If somebody says something about Finnish history, any history at all, any statement at all, the first thing I do is question it, even though it's an obvious statement. Okay, the world is round. Is it? And that's something that's lacking, especially in Russia today. And that's going to be really dangerous, because if people don't question anything, the media can say anything, and they won't question that. But still, the biggest problems I see for the Russian youth is economical problems. I mean, the biggest reason not to go to exchange from the universities, it's an economical question. I mean, they don't have they don't see, I mean, for example, Finland is a threat. Oh, I can't go to Finland, they're like the Western country. It's not that bad. But they can't go because they don't have the money to, and it's expensive even living in Finland. I mean, everybody doesn't even get free education in Russia on the higher on the universities, because they're limited to those most talented. And another question is civil society, which Maria also discussed very well about. I have my connections to the Russian Liberal Party, Yabloko, and the youth activists there. I've also followed them since 2011. It has been an interesting evolution of oh, here we're showing signs at the street, from oh, now I'm sitting in jail, Elis. Here's a picture. And I understand the struggle. I mean, you need a crazy amount of passion to keep on working in an environment like that you can do. I imagine doing the things I do here with Svensk Ungdom and risking getting in jail for it. I'm not sure if I would do it. Okay, I maybe would do it, but I'd say most of us wouldn't, because it's not worth the risk, especially when the chances of any like victory is so small. Because even in St. Petersburg, which isn't it's the same. My professor in Russia always said, "Oh, Russia, it's not St. Petersburg and Moscow. It's not. It's much more than that," and it's true. Because what we see is Russia, that's St. Petersburg and Moscow, which are the like easy parts, basically. But still, even in St. Petersburg, it's tough being politically active as a young person, and especially in the opposition, and especially in the not like official opposition. That's what I feel like. I think we need more basic thing we need is more understanding, and we need and not only blaming each other for things, because it's in the end we're all youth.
Thank you, Elis. Thank you for your wonderful point of view. Shall we go to Daria? Welcome for you too.
Thank you, Jaan, and thank you for organizing the seminar. Thank you, Maria and Elis, for your keynotes. And maybe I would like to bring up a more micro perspective on the question of young Russians, because my doctoral research deals with the issue of how young Russians in Finland live and how they experience their daily lives, with a special focus to working life and to employment. And sorry, I have a flu, maybe that's why my voice might be disappearing from time to time. And so again, coming back to the question of the seminar, how young Russians see the future, I would first say that the topic of the future and young people and how young people see the future has become quite central for the studies of young people nowadays. And more research is showing that transition to adulthood and transition to working life is becoming more fragmented and challenging for young people. And the reason is that young people disproportionately experience the burden of underemployment, of unemployment, and we also know that young people get caught in short-term work contracts, and they especially experience unemployment, and they get unpaid internships. So in this general context of young people's insecurity, I think it's quite fruitful also to think how young people's migrant background, their ethnicity, their gender, sexuality, and their legal status in the country, if we talk about migrants in Finland, interfere and interconnect with these general insecurities. And I think that the case of young Russian speakers is just the case in point. So in this short keynote, I would like to focus on how Finnish employers use young Russian speakers' legal vulnerabilities in Finland to exploit their labor and to abuse their labor, and also how immigration controls create situations when young people who are highly skilled end up in situations when they do work in low-skilled sector. This is a really big theme of my doctoral research, and it showed up from the interviews which I'm doing with young Russian speakers in Finland. So in my interviews, young people who come to Finland independently, I mean that who migrated to Finland without their parents or without family reasons or ethnic remigration, like in the case of immigrant Finns, they extensively discuss their copings with immigration controls. And basically, in order to have residence in Finland, in order to move in Finland, a migrant should be a worker, or his or her family member should be a worker. And that becomes quite a problem. For example, like Elis was talking about why young Russians wouldn't come to Finland for exchange or wouldn't move to Finland to study. Yes, this is the economical reason, but also I think immigration controls interfere with this migration channel quite a lot. So in order to get a residence permit as a student, a young person should have 7,000 euros on the bank account and should be ready to prove it to the police. And he or she should also have quite expensive private medical health insurance. And this is a huge economic cost, which makes it very challenging, the whole project of migration to Finland. And as we guess, not everybody has 7,000 euros in the bank account, and they have to do it every year, to show it every year, and they have to renew their permits every year. And we can say that their migrant status in the country is quite insecure and vulnerable. So what they do, they can also have a work contract in order to stay in Finland, even if they're students. So I can either have 7,000 euros in your bank account, or you can bring a work contract to the police in order to get the permit to stay in Finland. So what happens, because of discrimination in the labor market and quite a nationalist construction of the labor market and education in Finland, young people get jobs in the low-skilled sector because these are the most available jobs they can do. So they become cleaners in many cases. And of course we can say that Finnish young people can do these jobs as well, and this is really true that they do these jobs. But in case of young Russian speakers who are recent migrants and who have got this insecure migrant status where they have to renew their permit every year, their residence in the country is tied to the employer, is tied to the work contract. So this is basically the employer who gives the permission to stay in Finland for a person. So what it leads to enormous opportunities for exploitation of labor, of migrant labor in Finland. So because this is the employer who can dictate the rules and the work conditions for young people, because if the employer doesn't give the work contract, a young person will be out of Finland, he or she will be deported. And this is just the excerpt from the interview I was doing with my research participant, which I called Alina, who moved from Karelia to Helsinki after getting a bachelor degree in economics. And I quote, "I had to do 3 different jobs simultaneously to earn 7,000 euros to stay in Finland. My day would look like this. In the morning, I would be doing excursions around the city for tourists. Then I would go to clean hotels for a couple of hours. And in the evening, I would also work in a restaurant as a waitress. It lasted like this for several months with no day offs. They could even tell me that if I don't clean the tables fast enough in the restaurant, they will fire me the same day. This was a big disappointment in Finland. Yes, it is a bit insulting that I have a degree in economics and I work and a work experience in a bank and in a tourist company. But I had no choice. I promised myself that I will never treat myself like that anymore. And I can also add that young migrants who are workers, quite often they're not the members of the labor unions because their work contracts are so short-term for 3 or 4 months, so they can't join the labor union or they can help with the work trials. So they don't have the option when the labor union would protect them. And also other young people who want to bring their families to Finland from Russia, they should also bear with these conditions to have their families in Finland and to unite with their families because they have to earn a lot of money. And I think that even the average Finnish wage wouldn't be enough to bring the family from Russia. So what lessons can we learn from these stories? I would say that for many young people, thinking of future and long-term planning is being changed into short-term planning. And how Aline's case shows, planning of the future requires intensification of the present and coping with daily problems and daily regulations, namely immigration controls and more liberalized labor markets. And I think that the present becomes very intense for young people, and we need to think from the point of view of vulnerabilities which young migrants in Finland have. And I would also suggest that rather than blaming young people who come to Finland, and rather than focusing on their individual lackings, saying that they don't know the language, they don't have skills, they don't have education, my fieldwork shows that they do have all these skills. But I think that we need to focus more on the mechanisms in the receiving societies in Finland which create such situations when young people become so vulnerable in front of their employers and whose skills remain misrecognized and not acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria, very much for your interesting notes. I didn't know that much about the Russian speakers here in Finland and their challenges. It was really opening. We're going to go to the questions pretty soon. I'm going to start as a moderator, just have one question, and then we're going to ask questions even from the audience. I think it was interesting, Maria, that you mentioned about the state media, that if you have the state media replaced with something else, people would quickly change their minds and ideas. And I would like for you, could you open up who could replace it, how it could be replaced? I think that is the more challenging, right?
Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, obviously you've heard about the recent developments, including Crimea annexation and the Ukrainian conflict. And unfortunately, the authorities, intentionally or not, have been very effective in splitting the emerging opposition protest within the society. So the main driver of the opposition protest in Russia in 2011-2012, and those used to be really large-scale protests of over 100,000 people in the streets of Moscow. The main driver, the main group within those people used to be the Russian so-called creative class or the middle class. So that means the people in the middle age groups from 30s to the early 50s, well educated, well paid, in good companies and good careers, traveling abroad very often, definitely not watching state TV channels, and definitely looking for alternative sources of the information. This the so-called driver of the most modernized stratum of the society. Unfortunately, the Crimea annexation changed that. The post-imperial syndrome I mentioned is manifested lower in the younger age groups of the society, but nonetheless, the so-called successful, the victory in that conflict as perceived by the Russians, the annexation of Crimea, strengthening of Russia's international positions. You know, Russia is strong again. We've been able to basically pay back to the United States, because according to the Russians and the state TV channels, the conflict in Ukraine was not about Ukraine at all. It was about the United States. Everything that's going on, in fact, is about the United States. The Syria campaign is about the United States. The United States are everywhere. And it's only puzzling how Russia, being as strong, still is attacked by the United States on every single dimension in every single country. That's really puzzling to me, but nonetheless. But unfortunately, the Crimea annexation split the creative class per se. And many people who used to be very strongly opposed to Putin and the Kremlin because of the way country has been evolving, because of the economic crisis, because of the corruption and inefficiency in the economy, they a lot of them were bought off by the Crimea annexation, and the creative class has been split, including some of the younger groups within them. So right now what we see is that the opposition share in the society has definitely shrunk, primarily because all this corruption related discontent has been replaced by this happiness about the greatness of Russia on the international scale. And that's what we see. That's definitely a success of the Russian propaganda and an unpleasant development. Question is, how long is the status quo is able to continue? And here, this is where I think the characteristics, the fundamental key characteristics of the Russian youth come into play. I mentioned that they are more apolitical and more interested in their own personal gains, like the family, their own personal career progress. So the Russian younger people tend to be much more pragmatic, right? So they want to be successful, not in politics, because politics is not it's kind of rational, right? Russian politics is very close. There's no free elections. There's no free social lift within politics. You basically cannot change a lot. So it's only a pragmatic thing for you to do to basically change your career orientation from the political to the economic dimension. That means that shall the crisis, the big crisis, economic crisis in Russia intensify, this is the class which is going to be, this is the group that's going to be hit more. Because those are the younger groups, first of all, very vulnerable to be within the market, right? They're the ones who get the unpaid internships, the short-term contracts, but they also really want career, and they also very want consumption, because this is, if there's one word to define the Russian youth today, is consumption. This is like how they define the social status. It's not about their even certain achievements, certain personal merits, but it's about what kind of bag do you have. Is it Louis Vuitton or is it something lower level? No, if it's cheap, it's really bad. But if it's Louis Vuitton, you might deserve another look. So this is where they're going to get hit by the economic crisis, and this is what's going to make them oppositionary all of a sudden again. And I mentioned that the values are fluctuating really fast, right? This is all about whatever they get from the state TV channels, but also whatever they like at the moment, whatever they gain. They're very selfish and very pragmatic. So they're gonna be pissed at the Kremlin again. Give it some time. So on this, this is kind of a positive development that I can predict.
Yeah,
There's an oppositional joke about the battle between the fridge and the television, in which people will stop listening to the state propaganda on television when the fridge is empty. But we're not there yet. So.
Yeah. This is also just a couple of words. Unfortunately, the economic crisis also means that there's less employment available in the entrepreneur, like real business, like the middle business groups, right? So it means also that the larger shares of the Russian youth are being employed by the state corporations. That unfortunately imposes certain loyalty on their views, which is inevitable. It also means that the social lifts shrunk. That means that one way for your personal career progress, if you are from from smaller city, if you are from rural areas, so-called state-run organizations, like Nashi and other youth, state-run youth organizations that actually serve as a really good social lift for Russians, younger Russians from the rural areas. And unfortunately, this is like the downside. The more economic crisis worsens, less normal employment positions they have in the Russian economy. That means they become more vulnerable, more dependent on the state corporation and the state organization. This is the downward trend that is also there. So we're going to be observing this double fight between the fridge and this other trend.
Thank you. So now we're going to go to the audience questions. I'm going to ask, there is possibility to have 3 questions, and then our panelists are going to answer that, and I'm afraid we're going to finish after that. Please state your name, and please let Andreas, who's coming with mic, and please keep your questions really short. Okay? So, please, are there any questions? Here, gentlemen.
Yes, my name is Rolf Sandberg. I was very happy to hear Maria say that the youth are going to be more Western style. Probably through internet and other media, they got to know how it is outside Russia. But how can they influence the future with the present regime and the system and the restrictions you have in Russia? It must be very unsatisfying to know you could have a better life, but still you cannot do anything about it.
Are there other questions? Yes, here on the front row.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Robin Forsberg. I'm an economics graduate student. I have quite a few Russian friends, and one thing I've learned is that one problem maybe for future is some of the institutions that are in Russian. Corruption is big, and also you talked about trust, the lack of trust. Do you think there is a development to change these institutions for a better future? Anyone?
Do we still have a question? Well, yes.
If possible, I will just make some. I will just edit some information about Russian news.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Aina Murtak. I'm a political refugee in Finland from Russia. I want to say that about youth, about people in opposition, especially youth people. Nowadays, if you follow the Russian news, you can see that a lot of Russian young people who are high educated, like candidate of doctoral in physics, are they prisoned because they went to the opposition meetings. And also I want to add that about internet influence for youth people, Russian youth people, that Russian authorities, they hire people to control the internet and to give comments from the states, and they pay for people to do that job, and is one of these big issue of the propaganda. Thank you.
We're going to begin this time from Daria.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add to this picture of Russian youth in Russia. I think that maybe we should be more precise about what kind of groups we're talking about. And I think that even though that Maria divided it by the age group, I also think that there are different political movements even within these age groups. There are feminist movements, there are green movements, there are human rights activists, there are anarchists, there are oppositional movements, and within them, even with the same movement of feminists, there are a lot of clashes in between them. So I think that we have to also be a bit more sensitive to these differences even within these different groups. Yeah, this was my comment.
About the Western influence on Russian youth, I see one huge problem is the lack of skills in language, because we live in a society where practically everybody speaks fluent English, but that's not the fact in Russia. Not even by the higher educated people. I mean, everything is dubbed, and they have such an enormous cultural base themselves, so they basically don't need. Okay, they get a huge amount of Western culture through films and through the internet, but as they don't have the understanding of the language, they also lack a lot. That also kills the communication between us, because we don't have a language if we don't know Russian, because they're not studying Finnish, that's for sure, and only a few people know English good enough to talk English. I know from personal experience. And what I've found strange is even that you find alternative news, even like BBC has a really good Russian news site. They have alternative news and media in Russian also, but even then the influence is really small. I think it's because they have they still have the trust for official news. They believe in the state being the right news, sadly.
It is true, although recently we observe an interesting trend when the trust to the state-owned TV channels has been declining quite dramatically. We don't actually understand yet what exactly that means, because people keep repeating the propaganda message still, but for some reason they trust it less, and maybe that's an upside. Первый канал and all this, NTV, RTR, VGTRK, etc., etc. So that actually kind of even pushed the Russian state media into diversify a little bit the content. They started inviting more of the opposition leaders to the channels in an attempt to basically increase the public interest back. Maybe that's the beginning of certain kind of distrust to the state media, which would be a good thing. Now, basically those are two very similar questions, if I can summarize them all together. How do we change the current situation, right? So first and foremost, what I was trying to show you that even if it wasn't for Putin's regime, a really detrimental impact on the Russian society, the overall trend within Russian youth are quite similar to the one you observe in the West, in Europe in general. So Russian youth is much more globalized and in general more open, but it's important to understand that as sociologists or political scientists, we tend to kind of overemphasize the trends. But the Russian society, once again, overall, is very homogeneous, right? Many people, majority of the people do not speak English. They watch state TV channels. They tend to be patriarchic and kind of not independent. So, unfortunately, Russia suffered a lot from its Soviet past, more than even any other post-Soviet republic, and it will take us a lot to deal with that past, especially given that the political trend is the opposite right now. So expect more trouble from Russia to come in the foreign policy dimension as well. That's unfortunate. Now, the Russian youth is very pragmatic, and they did try. They saw the problems, right? Especially the more adult group of the younger generation, right? The so-called Generation X, the working youth, as I mentioned. They saw all these problems. They were the ones who were not thinking that Russia was an empire. They thought everything that was going on international was a lot of those things were problematic, and they tend to suggest still that Russia refocuses on its domestic problems rather than going on, keeping invading or participating in military conflicts abroad, right? So they know it, at least the Generation X, right? But they really tried to change. They were among those people who were out in the squares during the opposition protests in 2011, 2012. But they're also pragmatic, right? They just have one life. They don't have eternal life, unfortunately. They realized after the protest has been destroyed and many opposition leaders put in jail and repressions in Russia intensifying, they realized that there's little they can do. So how do they respond to that? The answer is, unfortunately, immigration. We have huge trends, hugely increased motivation to immigrate. That's kind of links us back to Daria's presentation. And especially among the younger Russians, they're much more active. They're not as entrenched within the Russian society. They're also much more westernized, and they kind of tend to speak with West younger people as their counterparts, as their equals, so it's easier for them to do. So up to 1/3 of the Russian young people want to immigrate, or at least think about that. Doesn't mean they'll do it, all of them, but of course it's not a very positive trend. Rather than changing the system within the country, they better go abroad and just live out there. Ivan Krastev, a very good political scientist, you might have heard about him, mentions that, who works in Europe, he mentioned that this problem in Russia right now, because of the open borders, the most creative, the brightest, the most talented Russian younger people leave because they understand they only have one life. They don't want to destroy it. They don't want to spend it in jail, you know. They better leave. And because they leave, that means there's much less protest concentrated within the country. So there's far less people within the country to change anything, right? So that is a problem, and at this point the regime realizes very well that it's an advantage to the system, right? If there's an opposition within the country, just push it outside and you'll be fine. That's what the system does. That's why it is unlikely that Russia will introduce another Iron Curtain, because they want all these people out. It's out of the country, not within the country, obviously. That's very pragmatic. So far the trends are negative, and all depends, of course, on how the Putin's regime will behave. It's also clear that the Putin is not planning to leave anytime soon. He can't leave because he's going right to the jail, right? He's going to stay there for a while, and that means that the repressions will keep intensifying and the current negative trends will continue, despite whatever positive trends we'll see there. But I personally have a lot of hope in the Russian youth pragmatism. I think they are much more kind of westernized than when the adult generation is. So, especially my generation, especially Generation X, which still remembers the period of the freedom in Russia. And if the economic problems will continue, and if the regime will continue making these very inadequate political decisions in a few years, not anytime soon, but in a while, it definitely will bring about certain change. Ultimately, modernization is there. I don't think that Russia alone will, cancel the modernization process altogether. We'll still observe Russia modernizing, but hopefully in the future, in the nearest future. We also need the Western help. That's what I'm going to have to say. The West has to realize Russia is our common problem, not only Russia's own problem. I think at this point it's kind of understood, and that's why certain kind of programs and maybe certain kind of policies are needed to help those elements within the Russian societies that actually want modernization. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and please join me in thanking our panelists in form of clapping your hands. Thank you. And we have something for you, just a small something to take home here for you.
Thank you so much.
And for Elis and for Daria. Thank you very much, it was wonderful. And I hope to see you guys in our future events. You don't have any rush to go home, but I think the speakers are going to be here if you have any questions. And please eat lunch afterwards if you need anything. So. Thank you very much.